Well, hello, and thank you so much for joining me today on another episode of Treasury Talks, where we talk with thought leaders across the nation, sort of coming to us on a number of different topics that affect our wallets, our pocketbooks, our economy. Today, I'm so honored to have with me Heather Jarvis. Heather is the legal guru to all things student loans, and I think, it's really an honor to have you with me today. I'd love it if you could give us a little bit of kind of your background, how you came to be Heather Jarvis.
Sure, I'd be happy to. My sister and I are first generation college educated, and so we learned from our family that education was the key to contributing back to your community and reaching your full potential. But what I didn't learn from my family was about how to pay for that, since we didn't have money. And so I borrowed a whole lot of money for my legal education, and then learned all about, just how burdensome that can be. And I had always intended to and did practice as a public interest lawyer. So that's what really first got me interested in student loans, was my personal experience with them. But I've been professionally dedicated to student debt relief efforts for, more than a dozen years.
That's fantastic, and we're so excited to get your take on so many of I think the probably the pitfalls is the way I think about it, but also really and truly your pearls of wisdom. You've traveled down this road. You've got the wounds to sort of say we're healing from the student loan debt. I too took out far too much student loan debt. One of the topics we're going to be talking about in a little bit, in a couple of weeks, is the public student loan forgiveness and what that looks like, and maybe what opportunities are kind of around the corner.
Yeah, absolutely. So, public service loan forgiveness is a potentially very generous loan forgiveness program for people who dedicate their careers to working in a government or nonprofit setting. And because we've known for a long time that people who dedicate their work to government and nonprofit tend to be paid less than they would be in the private sector. And we need educated people who are committed to doing those jobs. It's good for all of us to have educated folks in those positions. And so more than 10 years ago, it was back in October 2007, public service loan forgiveness first came online, and it was a US Congress program. And it enabled people with student loan debt to make affordable payments driven by their income while working in these public sector positions. And if they jumped through all the hoops of the program and did their work for a full 10 years, then they could earn loan cancellation or forgiveness of any remaining balance. Really wonderful promise of loan forgiveness. Unfortunately, because of some of the intricacies of the program and other issues with its administration, student loan borrowers had a hard time jumping through all the hoops and have not been getting forgiveness in any great numbers until recently. The current administration, President Biden and his Department of Education, have instituted what they're calling a public service loan forgiveness limited waiver. And this limited waiver period is actually done through the authority of the HEROES Act, which was one of the many COVID-19 legislations. And so it only extends through October 31st, 2022. But through October 31st, some of the more restrictive requirements of public service loan forgiveness are waived. So if like me, you borrowed loans some time ago, you may have been told years ago that those loans aren't eligible for forgiveness, or that they would only be eligible if you had already consolidated them. And those requirements are temporarily waived. So even people with older loans or people who didn't get all the information they needed are still eligible for forgiveness if they can document their public service work. So we're super excited about the limited waiver. It is a little bit complicated. So I know that your office is doing a lot to do outreach to people in order to let the employees of the state of Delaware and others who work in your state to benefit from this potentially very generous program.
So Heather, you touched on a handful of things. And one of the things that I also noted is that there are a variety of public service members who have very unique opportunities or challenges. And are you seeing that there are, specific buckets of, I hear a lot from teachers as an example, or I may hear specifically from some of our public defenders. Are you hearing from specific sort of groups that it's more daunting a challenge, or that there are more programs out there, that there are more opportunities to sort of help repay their loans faster?
Yes, it's a great question. So there are programs for people without regard to their profession or their job duties. Their public service loan forgiveness is for everyone who works full time for any level of government, state, local, federal, tribal government. There are also people who work for nonprofits that are structured as 501c3s. And then there are additional programs for particular professions, including teachers and also people in certain kinds of healthcare occupations, as well as attorneys in certain roles, as you mentioned. And so there are both specific and more general loan forgiveness and loan repayment assistance programs for those folks. I think teachers have certainly experienced throughout their careers a number of kind of attempts at creating relief for them through forgiveness provisions. But those sorts of programs have often found trouble in their application. They do tend to be limited to particular kinds of loans or particular kinds of schools or particular borrowers in certain repayment plans. And so it is important, if you're someone who has student loan debts, whether you're a teacher or not, it's important to recognize that you should take it upon yourself to ask all the questions you need to ask and do the research until you get really to the bottom of what you need to do for yourself. And a great place to start is at the Department of Education's website, which is at studentaid.gov. You can log in there with your federal student username and password and see your federal student loans. One thing that I recommend that all of the state of Delaware employees and others in nonprofit and government jobs do is really go through a tool on that website called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Help Tool, or the PSLF Help Tool, as it's known. And using that, you can actually get the database that includes your own loan information to prompt you about whether your loans are eligible for forgiveness or whether you might need to think about consolidating into the program known as Direct. And it will also give people a prompt to certify their public service employment, which is done by way of a form using the federal employer identification number for your employer. And so really visiting that site and going through the PSLF help tool is one of the best tips I have for people interested in either public service loan forgiveness or this limited waiver period that is on now through the end of October.
Let's say I get there, I get to PSLF help tool. And I find that maybe for whatever reason I don't qualify, and yet I still feel as though I need some help. You also kind of touched on the fact that you need sort of reliable, do that research, right? Where else would you guide folks to go that is reliable and where they're not going to feel like they're being scammed and that sort of thing?
Right. So it is important to watch out for scams. So look for sources of information that come from official government sources, as I've mentioned, but also from nonprofit organizations that are structured to assist student loan borrowers. One of my favorites is the National Consumer Law Center. They have a website that is studentloanborrowerassistance.org. And that website is particularly useful if you're someone who has struggled with student loans or who may need information about fixing a delinquency or even a default on a student loan. Some people, despite their best intentions, fall behind on student loan payments and then feel like they are afraid, understandably, to contact their loan servicing company. And when it comes to federal student loans, it really does make sense to be in touch with those companies, to keep your contact information updated with them, because there are always things that you can do with your federal student loans in order to achieve affordable payments. And so even if you think that you've messed things up, it can always be improved. So I am a big fan of that studentloanborrowerassistance.org website. I would also recommend that people visit the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a federal agency that has a lot of good resources for people with private student loans. And private student loans are just not as flexible and typically also are more expensive than federal student loans. So I think that that can be a pain point for a lot of folks.
I'm also curious if there are sort of common pitfalls, or I think about the repayment plans and things like that, and some of that temporary relief and how that can affect the the ability to pay over time, and sort of if you can talk a little bit about maybe what the average consumer is looking at in taking on debt, and what interest rates do and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think as borrowers and consumers of education and financing education, we should remind ourselves that, whenever you pay for something with the bank's money or the government's money and not money you've already earned, you will pay a fee for that. You will pay a cost for that. And student loans do have fees associated with them, but the primary cost of borrowing is the interest that accrues over time. And so I like to remind audiences and myself periodically about the essential features of interest. And the way it works is that interest accrues at a particular rate on the principal balance that we borrow over time. And I think that the fact that the passage of time increases the amount of interest that accrues is something that is not immediately obvious or intuitive. So just to use like a simple example, someone who owes $100,000 at a 6% interest rate would have $6,000 of interest accruing each year that he or she owed the $100,000. And so that really is, $500 a month just to continue owing the same 100,000 that you borrowed to begin with. So I think that although there are many useful ways to temporarily postpone either your obligation to pay at all or to reduce your obligation to pay, it's only smart to take advantage of that flexibility when you need it and when you have other more pressing financial concerns, which can include things like putting away money for a rainy day. It's important to have a safety net, and also to consider what other debts you may have and the relative cost of those debts. And so I don't usually recommend that people start sending, tremendous amounts over and above what's required to their federal loans until they have their financial house in order and things are relatively stable and secure. But once things are relatively stable and secure, you don't want to fall into the trap of just continuing to pay the lowest payment that's required. You can always pay more than what's due. and you can make extra payments. And if you do that, you can limit your costs and reduce your costs over time.
Yeah, this is extremely helpful. You've sort of touched on so many different topics. Can we just sort of guide people to maybe one last resource?
Well, I would recommend that people begin by getting a very clear inventory of all their student loans, and that can be a little bit trickier than it should be. So start by visiting studentaid.gov to see all your federal loans in one place. Know what your interest rates are. Also, pull a copy of your credit report at annualcreditreport.com and cross check those records and find your private student loans. Compare your interest rates and use some of those calculators online. They exist at the studentaid.gov site and other places. So you can really see how the interest accrues over time and how it makes a difference what actions you take. Also, don't give up on public service loan forgiveness. The program has been difficult for people to navigate, but there is this limited waiver period, and there's lots of reliable information and assistance for people, both through the government sites as well as through the seminars that your office is holding. And it requires some persistence and advocacy on the part of borrowers. But we're here to help them. I know I'm dedicated to it, and I know you are too.
Well, thank you so much. I am so excited to continue this conversation at the seminar we've got coming up. But even better, we've got this, sort of on the website so that people can come and view it at any time, and we'll have all of these resources together in one place. You are so wonderful to come and be with us today, Heather, and really share your knowledge. You're impacting so many lives. And so I just have to say, one, I really appreciate you taking the time. And two, I'm so glad that you took on the student debt that got you here today, because we're all benefiting from it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Treasurer, and thank you for your leadership in this area. We certainly appreciate it. I know that you don't have to be doing this extra outreach that you are doing for the people of Delaware, and I appreciate it very much.